This is Frank Islam, Chairman and CEO of FI Investment Group and your host of Washington Current Review, where we interview leading voices from business and politics and explore topics of current interest that impact you, the viewer. Today our guest is Dr. Anil Gupta, a professor of strategy at the Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland and the author of several books on corporate strategy and globalizations. And here's one of the best books that I have ever heard or known, but not read it yet. He just brought this one for me, so this is a book that he wrote. He'll be discussing the topics of getting on India and China strategy right. Thank you very much, Dr. Gupta, for coming. Appreciate that very much.
Delighted to be here, Frank.
Yes. How's the current economic crisis affecting China and India? It has affected a lot in the United States, affected a lot in Europe, all over the world. What about China and India? Is it affecting?
Yeah. Frank, I mean, in an integrated global economy, it is impossible for any country to be not affected by the current economic crisis, particularly given the size of the crisis and given that it originated in the United States, which is the world's largest economy. However, at the same time, both economies, China and India, that their internal dynamic of growth is much stronger and more important than the external dynamic. So if you just look at over the last 4 days, the best estimates have come out of Q4 2008 GDP figures for both China and India.
But the GDP figure for India is going to be a little bit lower this year than the last year, as I understand.
Yes, that's right. It will be lower, and that's again because no country can remain unaffected.
You got it.
But even then, if you look at Q4 2008, the figures for India, the best estimates for India that came out this week are 6.7%. The best estimates for China is 6.8%. Now, if you look at 6.7 and 6.8, they are phenomenal growth figures.
No question.
And they are phenomenal. With this, this is the kind of growth rate that would be the envy of the developed economies in the best of times. So clearly, China and India have been affected, but in the world's of the world's 12 largest economies, China and India still are the only two economies that continue to grow. Not only continue to grow, but continue to do so at fairly robust rates.
So obviously it has affected. I see it in Wall Street Journal in China. There's a lot of people that's suffering because of the economic crisis right now. So China has taken a lot more hit than India. They're about the same.
I think China has taken a bigger hit in the sense that if you look at 2007, China's GDP grew at 13%.
Okay.
And so a come down from 13 to say 6.8,
which is about half.
Yeah, which is about half. That's a bigger drop than, let's say, for India, it was around 9 to 9.4. From that to 6.7. And of course, China's economy is more connected in terms of exports to the global economy than India's is. So China has been affected more.
What is the current message of your new book, Getting China and India Right? This is the new book Dr. Gupta wrote.
Frank, the message of the new book is that of all the economies in the world, and certainly the top 20 largest economies in the world, China and India are the only two that feature 4 stories, each of them game-changing in its own right. Story number 1 is mega markets. But mega markets with a twist. Mega markets with what I say, micro customers. Customers with very low purchasing power, very low per capita incomes. But given the size of these two economies, mega markets, high growth markets. That's story number 1. Story number 2 is China and India as platforms for cost reduction, cost efficiency by meaningful amounts on a global basis for any enterprise. Number 3, that China and India produce the largest numbers of scientists and engineers in the world, whose costs are 1/3 to 1/5 of that in the developed economies. So therefore, China and India offer themselves as platforms to boost a company's intellectual capital by a sizable, meaningful amount. For companies like Microsoft and GE and Google and IBM and Novartis.
Correct.
And story number 4 is that China and India are the springboards, have become the springboards for the emergence of a new breed of ambitious global champions. We saw global champions emerge from Japan, from South Korea, and now we're beginning to see them.
Now that is their turn.
Now it's the turn of China and India. So each of these 4 stories is a game-changing story. But there is no other economy besides China and India where all 4 stories are playing out at the same time. And then what we say is that, look, this is what the China-India phenomenon is, and a robust strategy for a multinational company with respect to China and India is a strategy that recognizes each of these four realities and addresses each of these four head-on.
Okay, very well said. Thank you very much. You know, China and India, they're both part of the Asia. They both are what I consider a powerful country. They have a lot of consumer, close to about 2.5 billion people. What are the major similarities and differences between China and India?
Yeah, I think the similarities are hugely important.
Okay.
Differences are
Tell us a little
hugely
bit about
important. And I would like to begin by saying that actually the similarities between the two outweigh the differences. Although, you know, many people find that a surprising statement. Why do I say that? Of course, you know, the differences clearly, China politically, we know, is a command and control economy, whereas India's is a chaotic democracy. And so that's a huge difference.
Well, I'd rather take the democracy, but not chaotic part.
But every economy, every society is more than just the political system. You know, if you look at geographically, these are two very large countries. In terms of population, they're the two largest in the world.
No question.
The demographics, while China is about 8 to 10 years on average older, you know, in terms of the average age of the population. So China is an older population than India is. But, and that will have an effect, a negative effect for China's growth around 2020 onwards. But right now, China has a young population. India has a young population. And so that's a similarity. Both China and India, in terms of social culture, have massive emphasis on saving, on the
which
future.
Which we don't in our country.
That's right. Which is, you know, that and that saving, you know, for the future is more important than today's consumption. Both countries have, culturally, in fact, have a strong emphasis on investment, a strong emphasis on education, a strong emphasis on the family and on taking care of the children.
And those are all key ingredient of success.
That's right, absolutely. So there are many, many similarities between the two economies, between the two societies, but also huge differences, as in the political system. And also, you know, China started the opening up process, the liberalization process, global integration process.
They did earlier than India did?
That's right. So they started that in 1978.
Okay, India got to catch up.
And what India did was in 1991. Yeah. And that 13-year gap basically remains alive and well.
There's no question about it. What are some of the common mistakes that companies make when developing their China and India strategy?
Yeah, I think I pick up on my earlier point that China and India are four stories playing out at the same time. And the most common mistake that companies make is that they look at China and India from a very narrow lens, that they look at these two economies, let's say, from the lens of just offshoring and cost reduction. And they don't realize the innovation potential that China and India offer to boost a company's intellectual capital. Some companies do, like IBM and Microsoft and Google, but not every company looks at China and India from the lens of innovation. That's number one. Second mistake that many companies make is that when they think of these two countries as markets, they focus only on the top tier. You know, the big cities, the richer population, let's say the top 5% of the economy, the top 5% of the pyramid. Yes, of course, there is money to be made there, but bulk of the market today, and even bigger market tomorrow, is in the middle of the pyramid. And a lot of companies, the Western companies, they essentially stay away from that market.
Because they don't know better.
They don't know better, and they think of going to China and India essentially as taking their current products and services and saying, how can we find a market for them? Okay. How can we make money? But the buying power at the middle of the pyramid is so much lower that you really have to redesign, recreate new products, new services for that middle of the market. And some companies do that, but many companies shy away from that. And that's actually a very dangerous strategy, because somebody is going after that market, and whoever is going after that market is going to come after you at the top end.
You made a very good point about innovation. Being a cost-effective, United States and set up a lot of jobs back in India, as a matter of fact. Helped us a good example. You're talking about the outsourcing is a good example. But I never heard of the fact about innovation. That's a very key thing that you mentioned today here.
That's right.
Some of the company have missed out on that opportunity.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Because, I mean, you know, you look at, for instance, I take pharmaceutical industry as just an example.
That's a good example.
of where and because pharmaceutical industry right now is in deep trouble.
Right.
The top 15 companies over the last 8 years have lost more than $1 trillion in market cap. R&D investment by pharma industry used to be about $2 billion in 1980. Today, it's more than $40 billion, with no increase in the number of drugs coming out. And so if things continue like this, the pharma industry basically is going to collapse. What they need to figure out is how can they improve, enhance R&D productivity while actually cutting R&D expenditure, cutting R&D costs. And the only way to do that is to go where the talent is and where the talent costs 1/3 to 1/5, and that's China and India. Each of these two countries produces 3 to 5 times the number of chemists at the bachelor's level, at the master's level, than in the United States. And they cost, about 20%, 20-25% of that in the US.
Do you think it will remain, the cost effectiveness part in India and China will remain for the next 20 or 30 years?
I think 20, 30 years down the road, clearly the cost differences would be much less than they are right now.
It will come closer and closer now?
It will come closer and closer. But today, the cost differences are still very,
huge,
very large.
Huge. Well, thank you very, very much, Dr. Gupta, for coming to our show. I really appreciate that very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You're most welcome. That is our show. Until next time, this is Frank Islam for FY Investment Group, wishing you a great week.